Unaware his wife just signed a $1 billion deal only 6 hours earlier. Unaware the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast was watching his every move. He served her divorce papers minutes after she gave birth to twins. But he forgot one thing. He never actually read the prenup he wrote himself. He did not wait a second. He did not wait an hour. He did not even wait 15 minutes. 15 minutes after Dr. Aria Sullivan gave birth to twins, her body still trembling from emergency surgery, blood still seeping through the bandages wrapped around her abdomen, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold both babies against her chest. Her husband walked into the recovery room with another woman by his side and an envelope in his hand. Preston Whitmore, 40 years old, real estate mogul, eldest son of the most powerful dynasty in Chicago, wearing a suit that cost more than what the entire nursing staff made in a month, did not smile when he saw his children for the first time. He did not ask if Aria was okay. He did not look at the twins, a boy and a girl, their faces still red and crying softly, still bearing the marks of the violent journey that had just brought them into this world. He looked straight at his wife, the woman lying there with an IV in her arm and surgical staples holding her stomach together. The woman who had survived 6 years of his mother's abuse. The woman who had given up everything for him, and spoke in a voice so cold it made the room feel smaller. You are not my wife anymore. If this satisfies your soul, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what satisfies you. Because what Preston Whitmore did not know was that in the shadows, Lucian Blackwood, the man they called the Shadow King, had already decided his fate. The nurse standing beside the monitoring screen stopped all movement. Her hand froze on the patient chart. Her mouth fell open, yet no sound came out. She had worked in the maternity ward for 12 years, had witnessed thousands of births, had seen every kind of family tragedy, but never, not once in her life, had she seen anything as cruel as this. Aria tried to open her mouth to say something, but her throat felt crushed shut. Words shattered before they could take shape. Preston, I don't understand. He cut her off immediately, his voice sharp as a blade. There is nothing to understand. You trapped me, Aria. You think I didn't know. You stopped taking birth control without telling me. You got pregnant on purpose to keep me. My mother warned me about women like you from the very beginning. Aria shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks, mixing with the cold sweat on her blood-drained face. No. You told me to stop taking it. You said you wanted children. You said it was time to build a family. I said many things to keep you quiet. Preston shrugged as if he were talking about the weather rather than betraying the woman who had just given birth to his children. But the truth is, you were never worthy of that place. You were never worthy of carrying the Whitmore name. Veronica, the woman standing beside Preston, finally spoke. She stepped forward, her heels tapping softly against the hospital tile, her perfectly made-up face wearing a carefully calculated expression of sympathy. Aria, I know this is difficult for you. Her voice was gentle, so sweet it made one feel sick. But sometimes, the best thing we can do is let go. Preston and we didn't intend for things to happen this way. But true love can't be controlled. You should be grateful that Preston was honest enough to tell you the truth instead of letting you keep living a lie. Aria looked at the woman standing there in ivory and gold, as if she were attending a celebration of victory. 6 months earlier, Aria had asked Preston about Veronica. She had cried in the bathroom after seeing their messages. She had begged Preston to explain, and he had called her paranoid. He had said she was being irrationally jealous. He had made her feel guilty for daring to doubt him. Now that woman was standing in Aria's recovery room, looking down at her with the eyes of a victor. Preston continued, each word like a knife driven into Aria's chest. Where did you come from, Aria? An orphaned girl from Detroit. Parents killed in a fire when you were 8 years old. Raised in foster care. Beaten. Starved. You think I didn't know. You think I didn't investigate thoroughly before marrying you. You have no family, no lineage, nothing at all. I gave you everything. My name, my status, the right to step into a world you could never have touched on your own. And how did you repay me? By becoming a burden. By quitting your job and hiding in the basement, playing with test tubes like a child playing pretend. By turning into a useless housewife who can do nothing but spend my money. Aria wanted to scream. She wanted to say it was Preston who forced her to quit her job. That his mother had said Whitmore women were not allowed to work because it embarrassed their husbands. That they had stripped her of her career and now accused her of having none. But her throat burned dry. Her body was still shaking from pain and blood loss. The newborn twins in her arms began to cry louder, as if they too sensed their mother's collapse. Preston looked down at the twins, truly seeing them for the first time since entering the room. But there was no love in his eyes, no tenderness, only the cold disgust of a man staring at what he considered a mistake. "I never wanted children," he said slowly, one word at a time. "Especially not with you." Those words pierced Arya like a blade sharpened by 6 years of lies. She closed her eyes, and memories crashed over her in unstoppable waves. 6 years. 6 years she had lived inside the Whitmore estate like a prisoner dressed in fine gowns. The first day Arya met Margaret Whitmore, the woman had looked her up and down with the gaze of someone pricing a cheap item in a second-hand shop. She hadn't offered a greeting. She had simply turned to Preston and asked if this was the best he could find. Arya had swallowed her tears and told herself things would get better. She had been wrong. Everything only grew worse with each passing day. Margaret controlled every aspect of Arya's life. What she wore, what she ate, who she spoke to. She forbade Arya from contacting old friends because they weren't worthy of someone carrying the Whitmore name. She forbade Arya from visiting Detroit because there was no reason to return to that miserable place. She forbade Arya from working because Whitmore women were not allowed to embarrass their husbands by proving they couldn't provide. Bit by bit, Margaret stripped away everything that made Arya herself. And Preston, the man Arya loved, the man she had given up everything for, never once stood on her side. There were nights Arya cried alone in the bathroom after being humiliated by Margaret in front of guests. There were days she had to kneel on the kitchen floor and apologize to her mother-in-law for sins she had never committed. Once, simply because Arya accidentally spilled a single drop of sauce on the tablecloth, Margaret forced her to kneel for 2 full hours before dinner guests. Preston sat there, watching his wife on her knees, and said nothing. He continued eating as if nothing were happening. But the most painful memory wasn't the humiliations. It wasn't the nights of silent tears. It wasn't Preston's cruel indifference. The most painful memory was the day 3 years earlier, when Arya became pregnant for the first time. She had been so happy she couldn't sleep. She believed a child would change everything, that Preston would love her more, that Margaret would accept her. She had been wrong. Margaret found out before Arya even had the chance to tell Preston, and she wasn't pleased. She called Arya to the top of the staircase and said in an ice-cold voice that she would not allow a child carrying Arya's filthy bloodline to be born into that family. Arya didn't understand what was happening until Margaret pushed her. She remembered the sensation of losing balance. She remembered the steps slamming into her back, her stomach, her head. She remembered the sound of bone against hard wood. She remembered blood, so much blood. She lost her first child on the floor of the Whitmore home, and when she lay in the hospital, Preston came. She thought he had come to comfort her. Instead, he said his mother claimed Arya had fallen on her own and told her not to make up stories to cause trouble. In that moment, Arya had wanted to die. She had wanted to give up everything. But then she remembered Marcus, her brother who had died from sickle cell disease when she was 19. She remembered the promise she made to him before he passed, that she would find a way to save others from that illness. And she chose to live. She chose to go down to the basement every day, where no one paid attention to her, and continue her research in silence. Preston's voice snapped Arya back to the present. "Sign it." He placed a pen on the envelope beside her hand. "I don't have time for your emotional theatrics. Sign now, and we end this like civilized people. Fight me, and I'll make sure the whole world knows exactly what kind of person you really are." Arya looked at the pen, at the envelope, at the man she had once loved with her entire heart. Her hand trembled not from fear but because her body was still bleeding beneath the hospital gown. She had been cut open less than an hour earlier. She couldn't even sit up without gasping in pain. "I can't sign," Arya whispered, her voice breaking apart. "Preston, I just had surgery. I can't. That's no longer my problem." Preston checked the Rolex on his wrist. "I have a meeting in 45 minutes. Sign now or my lawyers will formally serve you tomorrow. Either way, this is over." What Preston Whitmore didn't know, what Veronica Hayes didn't know, what the nurse trembling in the corner of the room didn't know, what no one standing inside that recovery room knew, was this. 6 hours earlier, as Arya was being rushed into surgery, as doctors shouted that the fetal heart was weakening, and they had to operate immediately if they didn't want to lose both mother and children, her phone vibrated once. A single email. From Catherine Price. The attorney Arya had secretly hired 2 years earlier without Preston ever knowing. The subject line held only one word. Executed. Signed. The patent Arya had spent 6 years developing in the basement everyone dismissed. The breakthrough treatment for sickle cell disease she created, while the Whitmore family believed she was merely playing with test tubes like a child, had officially been sold to Blackwood Pharmaceuticals. For $1 billion, $1 billion was transferred into Arya's private account, an account Preston didn't know existed, at 9:47 in the morning that same day, 6 hours before he walked into the recovery room with divorce papers in his hand. 6 hours before he called her a useless burden. 6 hours before he told her she had nothing. Arya didn't research for money. She never did it for money. She did it for Marcus. Marcus Sullivan, her brother, the only person in this world who had ever loved her without condition. When their parents died in a house fire when Arya was 8, it was Marcus, 12 years old, who pulled her from the flames. It was Marcus who protected her in foster care when other children bullied her. It was Marcus who worked part-time jobs to save money for her books. It was Marcus who told her every day that she was smart, that she was special, that she would do great things. But Marcus had sickle cell disease since childhood. That cruel inherited illness tormented him his entire life. Pain so severe he couldn't stand. Endless hospitalizations. Nights when Arya sat beside his bed, holding his hand, praying to any god willing to listen. When Arya was 19 and Marcus was 23, he died. Not peacefully in his sleep, but in agony. In a crisis doctors couldn't control, Arya sat there, gripping his hand as it grew cold, and heard his final whisper. "Promise me. Promise you'll find a way to save others. Don't let anyone suffer like I did." Arya promised, and she kept that promise for 8 years. Even when Preston forced her to quit her job, she didn't stop. She simply moved her lab to the basement where no one paid attention. She worked every night after the house slept. She ordered chemicals and equipment using the small savings she managed to hide. She read thousands of scientific papers, tested hundreds of methods, failed more times than she could count. But she never gave up, because every time she wanted to quit, she saw Marcus's face in her dreams. And 2 years earlier, she succeeded. She discovered a treatment that could save millions of people with sickle cell disease around the world. She quietly contacted an attorney to register the patent. She secretly negotiated with pharmaceutical companies. And in the end, Blackwood Pharmaceuticals made the highest offer, $1 billion. But that wasn't everything Preston didn't know. There was one more thing: the marriage contract. The prenup Preston himself drafted 6 years earlier when he forced Arya to sign it before their wedding. He had been very proud of that contract. He even bragged to his friends at the engagement party that it was the smartest thing he'd ever done. The agreement protected all of his assets in case of divorce. But there was one clause Preston never imagined would apply to him: the infidelity clause. If either party was proven to have an affair, that person would owe the other 15% of the total combined assets held by both spouses at the time of divorce. Preston wrote that clause to protect himself, because he was certain Arya, the poor orphan girl with nothing, would never dare look at another man. He never thought he would be the one who cheated, and he certainly never thought Arya would possess any significant assets. But now, Arya had $1 billion, and 15% of $1 billion was $150 million. Preston Whitmore, the man standing there with divorce papers in his hand and his mistress at his side, didn't even have 1/10 of that amount. More than 800 miles away, inside a penthouse at the top of the tallest building in Manhattan, a man stood before a wall of glass looking down at New York City. The room was submerged in darkness. Not a single light was turned on. Only the glow from the buildings outside cut through the space, tracing sharp lines across the man's face. Lucian Blackwood, 36 years old. The CEO of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals on paper, but in the underworld, he was known by another name: the Shadow King, the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast of the United States. The man whose name even the most notorious criminals didn't dare to speak once night fell. Lucian didn't turn around when the door behind him opened. He didn't need to. He knew who it was by the sound of the footsteps alone. Rafael Santos, 34, Lucian's right hand, the only man in this world Lucian trusted without question. She delivered. Rafael stopped a few steps behind him. Twins. A boy and a girl. The mother is stable. The babies are stable, though it required emergency surgery. Lucian said nothing. He continued staring into the night, but the hand holding his glass tightened slightly. And her husband, Rafael continued, his voice turning cold. He just walked into the recovery room, with his mistress, and divorce papers. The glass in Lucian's hand shattered, shards cut deep into his palm, blood dripping onto the floor. But Lucian didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the wound. He simply stood there, his back still to Rafael, as the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Continue. Lucian's voice was low and slow, and Rafael knew that was when he was most dangerous. When Lucian shouted, it meant he still had control. When he spoke like this, someone was about to pay dearly. He humiliated her. Raphael read from the report in his hand, called her a useless orphan, called her a burden, said she got pregnant on purpose to trap him. His mistress was there too, speaking with false sympathy. Arya didn't sign the divorce papers. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Not yet. She couldn't. She just had surgery and she's still bleeding. But Preston is forcing her to sign immediately. Lucian finally turned around. The city light illuminated his face, and Raphael saw something very few people had ever seen and lived to speak about. Pure fury in the eyes of the Shadow King. It lasted only a moment. Then Lucian returned to his usual cold composure. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out a thick file. Inside was a photograph of a woman, Arya Sullivan. 2 years earlier, Lucian had come across a scientific paper while searching for a treatment for Raphael's daughter. Little Isabella, only 5 years old, had sickle cell disease, and doctors said she didn't have much time left. The paper was written by a woman named Arya Sullivan, a research fellow who had abandoned her academic career after marriage. But her research, though unfinished, pointed toward a breakthrough no one else had considered. Lucian ordered an investigation, and what he found made it impossible to look away from this woman. Arya Sullivan, 25 at the time, living like a prisoner inside her husband's family home, emotionally abused, isolated from the outside world, forced to give up everything that once defined her. Yet she didn't break. Every night, when the household slept, she slipped into the basement and continued her research. Alone, with no help, with no recognition, Lucian decided to help her without letting her know. He funneled funding through an anonymous research foundation. He arranged for equipment and chemicals to be delivered without raising suspicion. He monitored her progress from a distance and watched as she moved step by step toward a breakthrough. 1 year earlier, Arya's treatment saved Isabella's life. The little girl was now healthy, running and laughing as if the cruel disease had never existed. Raphael cried as he held his daughter in his arms, and Lucian swore he would protect the woman who saved that child at any cost. He waited. He observed. He prepared everything to pull Arya out of that hell at the right moment. And now, that moment had arrived. Preston Whitmore. Lucian turned the next page in the file. Does he owe anyone money? Raphael nodded, a cold smile forming on his lips. Salvatore Moretti. $30 million in gambling debt. The deadline is 7 days from now. Lucian looked up. Moretti, an old rival. The man who tried to seize Lucian's territory in New Jersey last year and failed miserably. Prepare the car. Lucian closed the file. His eyes were ice cold, but deep within them, a fire was burning. I want to see her. And Preston Whitmore. Lucian turned back toward the night. He's about to learn what it means to choose the wrong enemy. 3 days after the night, Preston walked into the recovery room with divorce papers. Arya received a notice from the hospital. Her health insurance had been canceled. The night nurse, the one who had witnessed everything that day, stood by Arya's bed with a face full of sorrow. She apologized softly and couldn't bring herself to meet Arya's eyes as she explained that Arya's husband, meaning Mr. Whitmore, had contacted the insurance company and removed her from his family coverage, and that without the ability to pay, the hospital could no longer keep her admitted. Arya looked at the nurse, then down at the 2 babies sleeping in the bassinet beside her bed. Ethan and Sophie, only 3 days old, were still so small, so fragile. They hadn't even fully opened their eyes to see the world, and the world was already ready to discard them along with their mother. Arya whispered that she understood and said she would leave. The nurse wanted to say something, wanted to object, wanted to help, but she knew she had no power in this situation. She could only stand there and watch as Arya slowly sat up, her face pale with pain, blood beginning to seep through the bandages around her abdomen from moving too soon. Her incision hadn't healed. The doctors had said she needed at least 2 full weeks of absolute rest. But Arya didn't have 2 weeks. She didn't have 2 days. She didn't even have 2 hours. At 11 that night, Arya stood outside the hospital gates with her newborn twins in her arms. She had no money. Preston had controlled all the finances for 6 years. She had no credit card, no personal bank account, not a single coin in her pocket. She had no home to return to. The house she had lived in for 6 years belonged to the Whitmore family. Her name had never been on any ownership documents. She had no one to call. Margaret had made sure of that long ago. Arya had lost contact with every friend from her college years. She had no living relatives. She was completely and absolutely alone. The Chicago night wind cut through her, sharp and merciless. Arya pulled the babies closer to her chest, trying to use her own body heat to keep them warm. But she was shaking. From the cold, from the pain, from exhaustion, from despair. There is one person, Arya thought, One person who might help her. Even if that person hated her. Even if that person had tormented her for 6 years. Maybe, just maybe, for the sake of the children, because they carried Whitmore blood, maybe Margaret would soften. Arya pulled out her phone. The old phone Preston had given her, the one he had forgotten to take back. She dialed Margaret's number. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Margaret answered coldly and asked what she wanted. Arya called her mother, even though she hated the word, even though saying it made her feel sick every time. She begged and said she had nowhere to go, that she only needed a few days until she recovered, that it was for the grandchildren, who were only 3 days old, that they were Margaret's own blood. There was silence for several seconds. Then Margaret laughed, a dry and icy sound with no trace of humanity. She said she had no grandchildren who carried Arya's blood and that Preston had already told her everything, that those children were a mistake, a trap Arya had set to hold onto her son. She asked if Arya truly thought she would allow her back into the house, or let those children soil the Whitmore family. Arya cried and begged again, saying she had no one else and didn't know where to go. Margaret cut her off and said it wasn't her problem, told her to go wherever she wanted, even back to the orphanage where she grew up, and ordered her never to call again and never to mention the Whitmore name because she didn't deserve it. The call ended. Arya stared at the dark screen of her phone and felt as if she had been pushed into an endless abyss, with no bottom and nothing to hold on to, only infinite darkness. Her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the sidewalk outside the hospital gates, clutching her babies and crying without sound. Too exhausted to cry out loud, tears streamed down in silence, and blood from her incisions soaked through her clothes and dripped onto the cold concrete. She thought about giving up. She thought about closing her eyes and never opening them again. She thought of Marcus and wondered if the other side might be kinder. She whispered into the night that she was sorry, that she wasn't as strong as he believed, that she couldn't do this anymore. The cold wind kept blowing. The newborns began to cry, their weak cries tearing through the night. And Arya sat there on the frozen Chicago sidewalk just before midnight, her incision bleeding and her heart shattered. She didn't know that somewhere in the darkness, a sleek black car was approaching, and that the man inside had decided that from this night forward, no one would ever be allowed to hurt her again. The black car stopped directly in front of Arya. She didn't lift her head. She didn't have the strength to lift it anymore. She simply sat there, holding her children close. Waiting for what? She didn't know. Maybe for death. Maybe for the end. Maybe just for a long dream she would never wake from. A car door opened. Footsteps crossed the sidewalk. Then a tall figure stopped in front of her, blocking the pale streetlight. Arya slowly looked up and saw a man. His face was half light, half shadow under the night lamps. His features were sharp, as if carved from stone. His eyes were steel gray, cold as winter ice. Yet deep within them was something Arya couldn't name. He didn't speak. He removed his black cashmere coat, knelt in front of her, and gently draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was so tender that Arya thought she might be dreaming. For 6 years, no one had touched her with such gentleness. "Stand up." The man's voice was low and cold, but not cruel. "You're not allowed to die here." Arya looked at him, her lips moving without sound. "Who are you?" "I'm Lucian Blackwood," he replied, and without waiting for her reaction, he lifted her from the ground, one arm supporting her back, the other under her knees, carrying her as if she weighed no more than a feather. "I'm the one who bought your patent, and from now on, you're under my protection." Arya wanted to resist. She wanted to say she didn't need protection. She wanted to say she didn't know this man and couldn't trust a stranger, but her body was exhausted. Her incision was bleeding. Her babies were crying from cold and hunger, and for the first time in 6 years, someone was holding her as if she mattered. She lost consciousness in Lucian's arms before she could say another word. When Arya woke up, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling soared high above her. Crystal chandeliers, white silk sheets softer than anything she had ever touched. The room was larger than the apartment she had lived in when she was single. She jolted up in panic and immediately felt a tearing pain in her abdomen. Gentle hands eased her back down. She shouldn't move. Her incision had become infected. It had been treated, but she needed at least 2 weeks of rest. Arya looked up and saw a middle-aged woman in a white coat. A doctor. "My children," Arya whispered, her voice hoarse. "Where are my children?" "In the next room," the doctor said softly with a small smile. "There are nurses with them. Both babies are healthy. You don't need to worry." Arya closed her eyes and exhaled in relief, then opened them again and looked around. "Where am I? Why am I here? This is Manhattan. You're in Mr. Blackwood's residence. He brought you here last night." Lucian Blackwood. The name echoed in Arya's mind. She remembered, the man with steel-gray eyes, the one who had placed his coat over her shoulders, the one who carried her when she could no longer stand. The door opened and Lucian walked in. In daylight, he was even more intimidating than at night, not because he was unattractive, but because he was dangerously handsome. And something in the way he moved and the way he looked at her made Arya feel like she was facing a predator restraining its instincts. The doctor left, leaving Arya and Lucian alone in the room. Silence lingered for a few seconds. "Why?" Arya finally asked. "Why did you help me? What do you want?" Lucian pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. He didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. 2 years ago, the daughter of my brother-in-arms had sickle cell disease, he said at last. The doctors told us she wouldn't survive. She was only 5 years old. Her whole life was ahead of her, and they told us she would die. Arya listened in silence. "Then I found your research," Lucian continued. "I followed your work from that point on. I funded your research without your knowledge. And 1 year ago, your treatment saved Isabella's life. She runs and laughs now, healthy, like any other child. Because of you." Arya's eyes widened. She didn't know. She had no idea her work had truly saved someone. She only knew it had been accepted and sold, not that it had changed a child's life. "So this is repayment," she whispered. "This is a transaction," Lucian replied, his voice still cold, though his eyes were not. "You rest and recover. Then you continue your research for my company. And I'll make sure no one ever hurts you again. Not charity. Not pity. You saved a child's life. Now I protect you. That's fair." Arya looked at the man sitting before her. Cold, distant, not a single smile. Yet he had flown through the night to Chicago to save a woman he had never met. He had placed his coat over her when she collapsed on the sidewalk. He had brought his own doctors to treat her wounds. He had arranged nurses to care for her children. "I don't know who you are," Arya said slowly. "I don't know what you truly want." But she looked down at her hand, carefully bandaged, clean and warm. "For the first time in many years, I feel safe. Thank you." Lucian didn't respond. He stood, walked toward the door, then stopped. "Don't thank me yet," he said without turning back. "You don't know what kind of man I am." Then he left, leaving Arya alone with thousands of questions and a strange certainty that her life had just turned in a completely different direction. Preston Whitmore discovered Arya was gone on the 4th day. He arrived at the hospital with his lawyer, carrying revised divorce papers, prepared to force her signature at any cost. But when he stepped into the recovery room, he found only an empty bed. The sheets had been freshly changed. There was no trace of Arya or the 2 children. "Where is she?" Preston grabbed the collar of the duty nurse, the same woman who had witnessed everything that night. "Where did she go?" "I don't know," the nurse stammered. Fear in her eyes mixed with a flicker of grim satisfaction she tried to hide. "She was discharged the night before last. I wasn't on duty. I don't know where she went." Preston released her, his face flushed with rage. He called home, called his mother, called everyone he knew. No one knew where Arya was. She had vanished into thin air, and that drove Preston mad. Not because he worried about her, not because he wanted her back, but because he needed her to sign the divorce papers. He needed her signature before the deadline, before it was too late. Preston hired a private investigator that same day, the best in Chicago, the most expensive, the one he believed could find anyone anywhere. 3 days later, the investigator called back. "I found her." His voice was strange, as if he were trying to conceal something. "She's in Manhattan, New York." Preston frowned. "Manhattan? How did she get the money to go to New York? She doesn't have a cent. She doesn't know anyone there. Where is she?" "In the residence of Lucian Blackwood." Silence. Preston said nothing for several long seconds. The name rang in his mind like an alarm bell. Lucian Blackwood. Everyone in high society knew that name. A name synonymous with power, with money, with danger. In the newspapers, Lucian Blackwood was the CEO of one of the largest pharmaceutical corporations in America. But in the darker corners Preston sometimes entered through gambling and drink, people whispered another name, the Shadow King, the East Coast Mafia boss. "Why is Arya with him?" Preston whispered, his voice unsteady. "I don't know," the investigator replied. "But I advise you not to get involved. Blackwood isn't someone to play with. I've done this work for 20 years, and this is the first time I've told a client to walk away. Wherever your wife is, whatever you want from her, forget it. Don't provoke Lucian Blackwood." Preston ended the call without responding. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from fury. His Arya, His prey, the woman he had controlled for 6 years, was now in the arms of another man, a man 100 times more powerful than him. Preston's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and felt the blood in his veins turn to ice. Salvatore Moretti, his creditor, the man he owed $30 million in gambling debt, the man he had avoided for 2 months. Preston swallowed and answered. Whitmore. Moretti's voice came through slow and dangerous. I hear you're looking for your wife. He knows, Preston thought. He knows everything. Moretti, I need more time. Preston tried to keep his voice steady. I'm dealing with family matters. Give me a few more weeks. You said that 2 months ago. Moretti scoffed. The deadline is 7 days, Whitmore. 7 days. No exceptions. No extensions. If I don't receive $30 million in 7 days, you know what happens. I don't have the money, Preston said, panic creeping into his voice. The company is struggling. I need to finalize the divorce to liquidate assets. But Aria disappeared and she refuses to sign. Aria. Moretti repeated the name as if tasting it. Your scientist wife. I hear she just signed a very large contract. Preston's heart skipped a beat. What contract? You didn't know. Moretti laughed, a sound that sent a chill down Preston's spine. Your wife just sold her patent to Blackwood Pharmaceuticals. $1 billion. Whitmore, the wife you thought had nothing turns out to be sitting on a mountain of gold, and she's staying in Lucian Blackwood's house. How interesting. Preston couldn't breathe. $1 billion. Area. $1 billion. Impossible. This is your opportunity, Whitmore. Moretti's voice grew dangerously sweet. She's still your wife on paper. Does she have a life insurance policy with your name on it? Preston said nothing, and that silence was answer enough. Good, Moretti continued. I have a proposal. Accidents happen every day, Whitmore, especially to weak women who've just given birth. Slippery stairs. Brake failure. There are many ways for someone to disappear without raising suspicion. You understand what I'm saying? Preston understood, and the most terrifying part was that he didn't feel disgust. He felt relief. 1 week after Aria arrived at Lucian's estate, Catherine Price appeared. The 45-year-old woman entered the living room with a confident stride, her neatly cropped silver hair framing eyes as sharp as razors. She wore a dark gray suit and carried a leather briefcase heavy with documents. Aria sat on the sofa, her strength partially restored thanks to the care of a private physician and proper nutrition, watching the unfamiliar woman with guarded eyes. Ms. Sullivan, I'm Catherine Price. Catherine sat across from Aria and placed the briefcase on the table. I'm your attorney, the one who helped finalize the sale of your patent. We've never met in person because every communication had to remain secret, but now it's time you understand exactly what you're holding. Aria nodded slowly. She remembered Catherine through emails and late-night calls made in secret after Preston and Margaret had gone to sleep. This was the woman who had protected the patent, negotiated the contract, and kept everything hidden for 2 years. Catherine opened the briefcase and removed a thick file, placing it in front of Aria. This is a copy of the marriage contract you signed with Preston Whitmore 6 years ago. Aria stared at the pages as nausea rose in her throat. She remembered that day. Preston had handed her a thick stack of papers and told her to sign. She had asked if she needed to read it, and he had smiled and said it was just a formality, that she didn't need to worry, that he would protect her. She had signed without reading a single word. She had trusted him. I know you didn't read it when you signed, Catherine said calmly, without judgment, stating a simple fact. But I did, very carefully. And there is one clause Preston Whitmore clearly never believed would apply to him. Catherine flipped to a marked page and pointed to a paragraph. Clause number 17. Infidelity. If either party is proven to have an extramarital relationship, that party must compensate the other 15% of the total combined assets held by both spouses at the time of divorce. Aria stared at the words, her heart beating faster. Preston wrote this clause to protect himself. Catherine continued. He was certain you, an orphaned woman with nothing, would never dare look at another man. And he was also certain that even if something happened, you would have no meaningful assets for 15% to matter. But now, I have $1 billion, Aria whispered, beginning to understand. Exactly, Catherine nodded, a cold smile touching her lips. And we have evidence of Preston's relationship with Veronica Hayes. Messages, photographs, witnesses. He has been openly unfaithful for at least 6 months. 15% of $1 billion is $150 million. Preston Whitmore doesn't even possess 1/10 of that amount. Aria sat in silence, looking at the file. The numbers, the clause Preston had written with his own hand to protect himself, and which would now become the weapon used against him. 6 years. 6 years of humiliation, abuse, being stripped of everything, being called useless, a burden, a woman with nothing, and now that man would have to pay $150 million for what he had done. You have 2 choices. Catherine placed another set of documents on the table. One is to sign the divorce papers Preston offered, waive all claims, and walk away with the money from the patent. Safe, clean, no conflict. And the second choice? Arya asked, her eyes never leaving the files. Fight back, Catherine replied. Take him to court. Expose everything he did to you. Force him to pay every dollar according to the contract he himself drafted. But it won't be easy. Preston will fight. The Whitmore family will use every tactic to smear you. Arya was silent for a long moment. She thought of 6 years of hell. Of the child she lost when Margaret pushed her down the stairs. Of the nights she cried alone in the bathroom. Of Preston's face as he entered the recovery room with his mistress and divorce papers in hand. Of the 2 children sleeping in the next room. Children their own father had called mistakes. I've been silent long enough. Arya lifted her head, her eyes dry and resolute. I choose to fight back. That night, Arya couldn't sleep. She stood by the bedroom window, looking out at the city of New York, glittering with lights below, her mind spinning with the decision she had just made. Fight back. The words sounded strong when she said them, but now, in the deep darkness of night, fear began to creep in. She was standing against the Whitmore family. She was standing against the man who had controlled her life for 6 years. Was she truly strong enough? Soft footsteps sounded behind her. Arya turned and saw Lucian standing in the doorway, still wearing the suit he had worn all day, as if he hadn't slept either. I didn't hear you come in, Arya said quietly. I didn't want to disturb you. Lucian didn't answer. He stepped into the room and stood beside her at the window, looking out into the night with her. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't need words to understand each other. Catherine told me you decided to fight back, Lucian said at last. That was the right decision. How do you know? Arya asked, her voice tired. You don't know me. You don't know how weak I am. For 6 years, I let them do whatever they wanted to me. I didn't fight. I didn't leave. I just endured and endured until there was almost nothing left to endure. Lucian turned to look at her. His steel gray eyes were as cold as ever, but deep inside them was something else. You think enduring is weakness? He asked. You think surviving 6 years of hell, continuing your research, finishing something that can save millions of lives, while being isolated and abused, is weakness? Arya was silent. No one had ever spoken to her like that. My mother endured too, Lucian said, his voice suddenly lower, distant. For 10 years, she endured my father. He beat her, humiliated her, turned her life into hell. And she never fought back, because she believed she was protecting me. Arya looked at Lucian, her chest tightening. This was the first time she had seen a crack in the icy armor of this man. What happened? She asked softly. She died, Lucian answered. His voice didn't waver, but his hand clenched at his side. When I was 10. My father beat her to death right in front of me, and I couldn't do anything. I just stood there, a 10-year-old child, watching my mother fall and never get up again. Silence filled the room. Arya didn't know what to say. There were no words that could heal a wound like that. She simply reached out and gently touched Lucian's arm. A small gesture. A connection. I swore that day, Lucian continued, his gaze still fixed somewhere far away. No one would ever hurt women and children in front of me again. No one would turn a mother into a victim when I could stop it. That's why you helped me, Arya whispered. Not just because of a debt. Lucian didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was in his eyes, in the way he looked at her, in the truth that he had watched over and protected her from afar for 2 years. Ethan's cry sounded from the next room, breaking the moment. Arya moved to go, but Lucian was faster. You rest, he said. Your wound hasn't fully healed. Before Arya could object, Lucian had already stepped out of the room. She followed and stopped at the doorway of the nursery, witnessing a scene she never thought she would see. Lucian Blackwood, the Shadow King, the most powerful Mafia boss on the east coast of the United States, was gently lifting baby Ethan from the crib. Hands that had given orders to kill were supporting a newborn with such care that Arya caught her breath. He rocked the baby softly, saying nothing, simply letting the child feel the warmth and steadiness of his arms. Ethan stopped crying almost immediately. The baby looked up at Lucian with eyes not yet fully focused, gave a tiny yawn, and drifted back to sleep. Arya stood there, leaning against the door frame, and felt something shift inside her chest. 6 years with Preston. 6 years she had never seen him hold a child, never seen him look at his own children with anything but indifference or disgust. But this man, the man the world feared, was standing in the shadows holding her son with a tenderness she never knew existed. Lucian looked up and met Arya's eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. They simply looked at each other across the dim room, with a sleeping child between them. And Arya knew, in that moment, that her heart was falling into a place she never believed it would reach, into the arms of the darkness. 2 weeks later, the confrontation officially began. The conference room on the top floor of the Blackwood Pharmaceuticals building overlooked all of Manhattan. A black oak conference table stretched nearly 6 meters across the room. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls surrounded them. Crystal chandeliers cast a cold, reflected light over the space. Arya sat at one end of the table, Catherine Price to her right with a thick stack of documents, and to Arya's left sat Lucian Blackwood, his back straight, his expression ice-cold, steel-gray eyes fixed on the door. Preston Whitmore entered with Veronica Hayes and his personal attorney, Marcus Reed. Preston was saying something to Veronica, a confident smile on his lips, as if he were walking in to claim an easy victory. Then he saw Lucian. The smile froze on Preston's face. His steps faltered mid-stride. All color drained from his face in an instant, as if the blood had been pulled straight out of his body. Lucian didn't stand. He simply sat there, one leg crossed over the other, watching Preston with the calm focus of a lion observing prey that had wandered into its territory. "Mr. Whitmore," Catherine spoke first, her voice sharp and professional. "Please have a seat. We have much to discuss." Preston swallowed and forced himself to regain composure. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Arya, but his eyes kept darting back to Lucian. Veronica sat beside him, her face no longer wearing the sweet confidence she had shown at the hospital. She knew she was in dangerous territory. "Why is he here?" Preston finally demanded, pointing at Lucian. "This is a family matter between me and my wife. It has nothing to do with outsiders." Lucian didn't respond. He merely tilted his head slightly, a small movement filled with threat. "Mr. Blackwood is a business partner of my client," Catherine replied calmly. "He has every right to attend any meeting concerning Miss Sullivan's interests. Now, if you're seated, we can begin." Catherine opened her leather briefcase and removed a thick file, placing it in the center of the table and sliding it toward Preston and Marcus Reed. "This is a copy of the patent sale agreement between Miss Arya Sullivan and Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, signed on November 18th. Contract value $1 billion. Payment was completed at 9:47 that morning." Preston stared at the file as if it were a venomous snake. $1 billion, he stammered. "That's impossible. She has nothing. She was just playing with test tubes in the basement." Arya looked at Preston, and for the first time since entering the room, she spoke. "You never asked what I was doing in that basement, Preston." Her voice was calm, cold, nothing like the trembling woman in the recovery room 2 weeks earlier. "You never cared enough to ask." Preston opened his mouth to respond, but Catherine continued. "And this," she produced another file, "a copy of the prenuptial agreement you personally drafted and signed 6 years ago, particularly Clause 17 concerning infidelity." Marcus Reed snatched the document and flipped rapidly through the pages. His face grew paler with every line he read. 15% of total combined assets, Catherine read aloud, her voice carrying a quiet satisfaction. "Of both spouses. At the time of divorce, if one party is proven unfaithful." "She has no proof," Preston blurted, panic creeping into his voice. "She can't prove anything." Catherine smiled, and that smile was colder than even Lucian's gaze. "Text messages between you and Ms. Hayes over the past 6 months." She placed a printed stack on the table. "Photographs of you and Ms. Hayes at the Peninsula Chicago, the Ritz-Carlton New York, and 17 other locations." She added another stack of photos, testimonies from hotel staff, and statements from messages Ms. Hayes sent to her cosmetic clinic, bragging about her relationship with Mr. Whitmore, Chicago, real estate tycoon. Veronica gasped, her eyes widening. She hadn't known her private messages had been collected. She looked at Preston, then at the evidence on the table, and something shifted in her expression. "Under the clause you drafted yourself," Catherine continued, "you owe my client 15% of the total combined assets, $1 billion belonging to Miss Sullivan, plus your assets estimated at $50 million. That totals $1,050 million. 15% equals $157.5 million. We are prepared to round it down to $150 million. Preston couldn't breathe. $150 million. He didn't have it. He didn't have even a tenth of that amount. His company was on the brink of collapse. He owed Moretti $30 million. And now the wife he believed had nothing was demanding $150 million. "This is fabricated," Preston shouted, leaping to his feet as his chair crashed backward. She can't have $1 billion. She's an orphan. She has nothing. She belongs to me. Lucian moved. Just slightly. He placed one hand on the table and leaned forward. That alone was enough to freeze the entire room. She belongs to no one, Lucian said, his voice low and deliberate, each word landing like a bullet. Least of all you. Preston looked at Lucian, then at Arya, then back at Lucian, and he understood. He understood why Arya was in this man's home. He understood how she suddenly had the best lawyer and airtight evidence. He understood that he had chosen the wrong enemy. Veronica stood up. Preston, I think we need to talk privately, she said, her voice trembling. She no longer looked at him like a lover. She looked at him like a sinking ship she needed to abandon before it was too late. Preston ignored her. He stared at Arya, his face flushed with rage and desperation. You can't do this to me, he snarled. You can't. Arya rose slowly, facing the man who had tormented her for 6 years. She didn't shake. She didn't fear him. She met his eyes and spoke evenly. I'm not doing anything to you, Preston. I'm simply using the weapon you created yourself. Preston stood there, breathing hard, his eyes bloodshot with rage. He stared at Arya as if he couldn't believe what was happening. The woman standing in front of him was no longer the trembling wife in the recovery room 2 weeks earlier. No longer the woman who bowed her head and apologized every time his mother shouted at her. No longer the silent shadow who had followed him for 6 years without daring to resist. This woman stood straight, her eyes dry, her voice steady, and she was looking at him the way one looks at an insect beneath a heel. Who do you think you are? Preston roared. What do you think you can do to me? You're just an orphan. Someone with nothing before you met me. I gave you everything. My name, my status, a roof over your head. And this is how you repay me. By betraying me, by sleeping with this Mafia bastard. Arya didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She simply looked at Preston with an expression she had never allowed him to see before. The gaze of someone who had endured enough. You want to talk about betrayal, Preston? Arya's voice rang out, clear and cutting. You, who brought your mistress into your wife's recovery room 15 minutes after she gave birth. You, who called your own children mistakes. You, who stood there while your mother pushed me down the stairs and killed our first child, then said I fell on my own. You want to talk to me about betrayal? Preston went pale. He hadn't thought Arya would bring that up. He hadn't thought she would dare. That was an accident, he stammered. My mother didn't touch you. You fell. You were always clumsy like that. Arya laughed, a laugh without warmth, without joy, filled only with the bitterness of 6 years held down. You know what, Preston? For 6 years, you and your mother tried to turn me into nothing. You forced me to quit my job, then mocked me for having no career. You isolated me from my friends, then said I had no one who cared. You controlled my finances, then called me a parasite. You did everything you could to make me believe I had no value beyond being your wife. She stepped forward, and Preston instinctively stepped back. But do you know what? Arya continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. While you called me useless, I was saving millions of lives. While your mother forced me to kneel, I was building my own empire. While you were in bed with Veronica, I was signing a $1 billion contract. You think my silence was weakness, Preston. She stopped and looked straight into his eyes. Silence isn't weakness. Silence is focus. The room fell into absolute silence. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Veronica had backed toward the door at some point, her face drained of color. Marcus Reed sat frozen with the files in his hands, his mouth open but unable to speak. And Preston. Preston was shaking, not with anger anymore, but with fear, with despair, because he realized everything was collapsing and there was no way out. You don't understand, Preston said, his voice suddenly shifting from rage to pleading. You don't know what's happening. I need money. I need you to sign the divorce papers. If you don't, they'll kill me. Who will kill you? Arya asked coldly. Moretti. Preston swallowed, his eyes filling with tears. Salvatore Moretti. I owe him $30 million. I have 7 days to pay. No, now only 3 days left. If I don't pay, he'll kill me. Lucian leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharpening. Moretti. He murmured the name as if tasting something bitter. And where were you planning to get the money to pay him? Preston stayed silent. He didn't dare look at Lucian. He didn't dare look at Arya either. From where, Preston? Arya stepped closer, her voice hardening. Where were you going to get the money? Preston remained silent, but his silence was answer enough. From me. Arya said slowly, each word dripping like acid. "You planned to force me to sign the divorce papers to take control of my assets, but you didn't know I had money. So what were you planning to do if I were still the poor wife you believed me to be?" Preston looked at Arya, trembling, and in that moment she saw the truth in his eyes, a truth so horrific it nearly made her collapse. "Moretti," Preston whispered, his voice breaking. He said if you had an accident, I'd get the life insurance payout. He said he could arrange it. Slippery stairs, brake failure, things like that happen every day. He said no one would suspect anything. Arya felt her heart stop for a beat. "You agreed," she whispered. "You agreed to let them kill me." Preston didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was written across his guilty face. The man she had married, the father of her children, had agreed to a plan to kill her for insurance money. Lucian stood up, slowly, deliberately. Yet every movement radiated lethal danger. "Raphael," he said without turning. The conference room door opened, and Raphael stepped in as if he had been waiting outside all along. "Find Moretti," Lucian said, his voice ice cold. "I want to see him. Tonight." Preston looked at Lucian, then at Raphael, then at Arya, and he understood that he hadn't merely lost the wife he had underestimated. He had kicked a hornet's nest, and the swarm was led by the Shadow King. The conference room sank into suffocating silence after Preston's confession. Arya stood there, her feet rooted to the floor, staring at the man she had married, unable to believe what she had just heard. 6 years. She had lived with this man for 6 years, slept beside him every night, carried his children twice, and he had agreed to let someone else kill her. Not out of hatred, not out of jealousy, but for money, for a life insurance payout. He had been willing to trade her life for a few $1,000,000 to cover his gambling debts. Veronica was already gone. She had slipped out of the room when no one was paying attention, leaving Preston alone to face the consequences. The first rat abandoning a sinking ship. Marcus Reed, Preston's lawyer, was shoving documents into his briefcase, his hands shaking so badly that several pages fell to the floor. "I didn't know anything about this," he stammered. "I was only handling the divorce. I had nothing to do with any plan involving any kind of accident." He hurried out, almost running, leaving Preston utterly alone. Preston turned to Arya, his eyes wild like a cornered animal. "You have to understand me," he pleaded. "I had no other choice. Moretti would have killed me if I didn't pay him. I was just trying to survive. I never really wanted to hurt you. I was desperate." Arya looked at him. 6 years ago, she had loved this man. She had believed he was the prince of her life, the one who would lift her out of poverty and give her a family. She had been wrong, so terribly wrong. "You had a choice," Arya said, her voice cold as ice. "You could have told me the truth. You could have asked me for help. You could have done anything else instead of agreeing to let them kill me. But you chose this. You chose my life in exchange for money. Don't ever tell me you had no choice." The conference room door opened again. Everyone turned, and Arya sucked in a sharp breath when she saw who entered. James Whitmore, 35 years old, Preston's younger brother, the only person in the Whitmore family who had ever treated her with kindness. James was nothing like Preston. He didn't carry his brother's cold arrogance. He worked in medicine as a cardiovascular surgeon and had stepped away from the Whitmore shadow years ago because he couldn't tolerate their mother's cruelty. Once, when Margaret forced Arya to kneel in front of guests, James had stood up and left, and didn't speak to the family for 3 months. That had been the only time Arya felt someone in that family saw her as a human being. "James," Preston whispered, his face drained of color. "What are you doing here?" "You've gone too far, Preston," James said, his voice heavy with disappointment and disgust. He stepped to Arya's side, turning his back on his brother. "I've been silent for too long. I let you and Mother do whatever you wanted because I didn't want conflict, but this is my limit." James turned to Catherine Price. "I want to testify," he said, "about everything I've witnessed over the past 6 years, about how my mother treated Arya, about the time she pushed her down the stairs. I was there. I saw everything, and I was a coward for not speaking up. But I will now." Arya looked at James, tears rising despite herself. For 6 years, she had believed she was completely alone in that family. She never knew someone had seen her suffering and felt pain for her. "James," Preston shouted, "you can't do this. You're my brother. Blood is blood. You can't betray the family." James turned to him, contempt filling his eyes. "You want to talk about betrayal, Preston? You agreed to kill your wife. You let Mother kill your child. You have no right to speak about loyalty or betrayal." Preston staggered back, hitting the wall behind him. He looked around like a trapped animal searching for escape, but there was none. His brother had turned against him. His mistress had abandoned him. His lawyer had fled. And the wife he had despised was standing there with $1 billion and the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast at her side. Lucian stood and walked toward the door. He stopped beside Preston, and though he didn't touch him, Preston recoiled as if struck. "You have 48 hours to accept the compensation terms," Lucian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "After that, we proceed to court, and I assure you, what happens there will be far worse than what's happening in this room. As for Moretti..." Lucian tilted his head, looking at Preston the way one looks at an insect. "You don't need to worry about him anymore. I'll handle it." Lucian walked out, Raphael following him. Arya watched the man who had saved her disappear through the doorway, and she knew that tonight, the darkness would come to collect its debt. That night, at 11:45, darkness swallowed Lucian's Manhattan estate. Arya had been moved into a secure room in the basement earlier that evening with her 2 children, 4 guards stationed outside for the entire night. She didn't understand why Lucian had suddenly relocated her, but the look in his eyes when he told her to stay there until he returned stopped her from asking any questions. Lucian knew Moretti would come. He knew it the moment Preston confessed everything in the conference room. Salvatore Moretti wasn't the kind of man who accepted losing his prey without retaliation. Once he learned Arya was under Lucian's protection, once he knew the staged accident plan had been exposed, Moretti had only 2 choices: retreat or attack. And Salvatore Moretti never retreated. At midnight, 14 black trucks stopped 2 blocks away from the estate. Nearly 50 men dressed in black poured out, heavily armed, moving through the darkness like ghosts. Moretti had mobilized almost his entire force for this night. He meant to end everything once and for all. Kill Lucian, take Arya, extort the money from Preston. A perfect plan in his mind. What Moretti didn't know was that Lucian had been waiting for this night for a very long time. The estate looked quiet, almost asleep, with only a few dim lights glowing inside. The front gate stood slightly open, as if the owner had gone to bed and forgotten to lock it. Too easy. Moretti's men flooded in like a broken dam. The first group rushed the gate, the second scaled the rear wall, the third moved through the underground entrance. They thought they were surrounding their prey. They didn't know they had walked straight into a trap. The first gunshot rang out at 12:11. It didn't come from Moretti's men. It came from the shadows on the rooftops no one had seen. Raphael stood on a 3rd-floor balcony, a sniper rifle steady in his hands, calmly taking targets down one by one. Each shot dropped a man. Precise, cold, not a single bullet wasted. Lucian's security teams emerged from every direction. They had been hidden all day, waiting for this exact moment. The garden turned into a battlefield. Gunfire echoed. Shouts rang out. Bodies hit the ground. Within 15 minutes, nearly 50 of Moretti's gunmen were either dead or captured. Not a single one made it inside the estate. Moretti watched from inside an armored vehicle a block away, as his force was annihilated like ants under a magnifying glass. His face went pale with rage and fear. He didn't understand what was happening. He had planned carefully. He had brought enough men. He had been certain he'd win. The car door flew open. Before Moretti could react, a hand grabbed him by the collar and dragged him out. He hit the pavement hard, looked up, and found himself staring into steel-gray eyes colder than winter ice. Lucian Blackwood stood over him, his suit immaculate, as if he'd just stepped out of a cocktail party instead of a firefight. Not a drop of blood on him, not a single hair out of place. Only a cold smile as he looked down at the enemy at his feet. "Salvatore," Lucian said softly, like greeting an old friend. "It's been a while." "Blackwood," Moretti snarled, trying to rise before Raphael slammed him back down. "Who do you think you are? You think you can touch my people? I'll kill you. I'll kill your entire family. I'll burn everything you own to the ground." Lucian chuckled. There was no warmth in it. "Are you threatening me, Salvatore?" He crouched down until they were eye to eye. "You lost nearly 50 men in 15 minutes. You're lying at my feet, and you still think you're in a position to threaten me." Moretti ground his teeth, his eyes blazing with hatred. "Because of that woman," he spat. "You destroyed everything over a woman. Since when does the Shadow King have a heart?" Lucian was silent for a moment. Then he stood, brushing his hands as if he'd touched something filthy. "She's not a woman," he said slowly. "She's mine, and you agreed to a plan to kill her. You put your hands on something that never belonged to you." He turned away, signaling Raphael. "That was the biggest mistake of your life, Salvatore." Lucian walked back into the darkness. "I won't kill you tonight," he added without looking back. Death would be too easy for someone like you. Instead, I'll take everything you have, your territory, your networks, your people, one by one, until you're left with nothing, until you're begging on the streets and remembering this night as the moment you lost everything. Raphael stayed behind, looking down at Moretti with open contempt. You should be grateful, he said. The boss spared your life. If it were up to me, I'd have slit your throat the moment you mentioned Miss Sullivan. Raphael turned and walked away, leaving Moretti sprawled on the cold pavement, surrounded by the bodies of the army he'd lost. That night, the news spread through the underworld like wildfire. Salvatore Moretti had attacked Lucian Blackwood, and Moretti had been utterly destroyed. The Shadow King was still king, and anyone who dared touch what was his would pay the price. At 3 a.m, when the last gunshots had finally fallen silent, and darkness reclaimed the estate with a deadly stillness, Lucian descended into the basement. He had changed out of his dust-stained suit into a black shirt, but the scent of gunpowder still clung to him. He opened the door to the safe room and saw Arya sitting on the floor, her back resting against the crib where Ethan and Sophie slept peacefully. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, fixed on nothing at all. When she heard the door, she looked up, and Lucian saw the faint tracks of dried tears on her cheeks. She had cried, alone, in the dark, while he had been fighting above. It's over, Lucian said, his voice weary but relieved. Moretti isn't a threat anymore. You're safe. Arya looked at him, and instead of thanking him, instead of letting out the breath Lucian thought she'd been holding, she asked a question he hadn't expected. Are you hurt? Lucian froze. No one ever asked him that. Ever. Raphael reported casualties. Doctors treated wounds. But no one ever asked Lucian Blackwood, the Shadow King, whether he was hurt. No one cared enough to ask. No, he said after a moment. I'm not hurt. Arya slowly stood and walked toward him. She stopped right in front of Lucian, looked up, and placed her hand over his chest, right above his heart. Lucian stopped breathing. His body went rigid beneath her small hand. You killed people tonight, Arya said softly. For me. You risked everything. For me. Why? Lucian looked down into her brown eyes. Eyes that held no fear, no judgment, only sincere curiosity, and something deeper he didn't dare name. I don't know what love is, Lucian said, his voice low and rough. I grew up in violence. I live by violence. Love, family, happiness, those things don't exist in my world. I don't know how to hold someone's hand without hurting them. I don't know how to hold someone without making them afraid. He lifted his hand and touched Arya's cheek, so gently it was as if he feared she might shatter beneath his fingers. But when I thought about what Moretti wanted to do to you, when I thought about Preston agreeing to have you killed, I wanted to burn the entire world down. I wanted to destroy anyone who dared think about hurting you. I wanted to keep you in my arms and never let anything touch you again. Lucian paused, drawing in a slow breath. I don't know if that's love, he said, but it's everything I have to give. Arya looked at the man standing before her. The Shadow King, the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast, the man the underworld feared. And he was standing here, opening himself for the first time in his life to a woman, his voice unsteady with uncertainty, his eyes full of fear of rejection. That is love, Lucian, Arya whispered. Your kind of love, and I accept it. She rose onto her toes and kissed him. Their first kiss wasn't gentle. It wasn't cinematic or soft. It was fierce, desperate, like two people lost their entire lives finally finding their way home. Lucian froze for a heartbeat, as if he couldn't believe it was real. Then his arms wrapped around Arya's waist, pulling her against his chest, and he kissed her as if she were the only oxygen left in the suffocating room. They kissed in the basement safe room, with their 2 children sleeping quietly in the crib beside them, with the smell of gunpowder still clinging to his clothes, with the trace of tears still on her cheeks. They kissed as if the outside world no longer existed, as if there were only the 2 of them, 2 broken souls who had found each other in the dark. When the kiss ended, Lucian rested his forehead against Arya's, his breath warm against her lips. I won't let anyone hurt you again, he whispered. Never. Arya smiled, her first real smile since the night in the hospital. I know, she said. And I won't let anyone hurt you either. 6 weeks after that night of blood, the trial came to an end. The Manhattan County Courthouse was packed with reporters and onlookers, eager to witness the collapse of the Whitmore family. The story had spread everywhere like wildfire. A Chicago real estate tycoon handing his wife divorce papers 15 minutes after she gave birth. The wife turning out to be a billionaire scientist. The husband plotting to kill her for insurance money. The media called it the case of the decade. Preston Whitmore entered the courtroom in a wrinkled suit, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He had lost everything. His real estate company collapsed after investors pulled out en masse when the scandal broke. His bank accounts were frozen, his properties seized. He couldn't even afford a competent lawyer and had to rely on a court-appointed attorney. Catherine Price stood beside Arya, calm and composed as always. She placed folder after folder before the judge. Evidence of adultery. Evidence of psychological abuse. Testimony from James Whitmore about Margaret pushing Arya down the stairs. Testimony from the nurse about what happened in the recovery room. And most importantly, the recorded phone call between Preston and Moretti, in which Preston agreed to the accident plan. Raphael had obtained the recording from Moretti's phone on the night of the attack, a small gift Lucian sent to Justice. The judge read the verdict in an even voice, but every word landed like a hammer sealing Preston's coffin. The defendant, Preston Whitmore, is ordered to compensate the plaintiff Arya Sullivan $150 million under Clause 17 of the prenuptial agreement, an additional $20 million in damages for emotional abuse and coercion throughout the marriage. A total of $170 million, payable within 90 days. Preston didn't have $170 million. He didn't have $1 million. He didn't even have $100,000. The ruling meant he would have to sell everything, including what he didn't own, and still remain in debt for the rest of his life. But that wasn't the worst of it. Regarding the charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, the judge continued. The court finds sufficient evidence to proceed with prosecution. The defendant is remanded into custody without bail pending trial. Preston collapsed. Literally, his knees buckled and he fell to the courtroom floor in front of hundreds of witnesses. Court officers moved in, cuffed his hands, and dragged him to his feet. As they led him past Arya, Preston stopped and looked at her with eyes full of hatred and despair. "You'll regret this," he rasped. "I swear you'll regret this." Arya met the gaze of the man who had once been her husband, the man who had abused her for 6 years, the man who had agreed to have her killed for insurance money. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. She only felt pity. "You once asked what love builds, Preston," she said softly. "Now you know. Love done right builds empires. Cruelty like yours only builds prisons for yourself." The officers pulled Preston away. He didn't look back again, and Arya knew that was the last time she would ever see him. Veronica Hayes disappeared immediately after the trial. She slipped out of the city overnight, leaving no address, contacting no one. There were rumors she fled to California, rumors she left the country. Wherever she went, she carried disgrace and a ruined name. No one wanted to be associated with a woman who had slept with a man who plotted to kill his wife. Margaret Whitmore never set foot in the courtroom. She never got the chance. 3 days after Preston was arrested, when news of the case spread through Chicago's elite circles, when the friends she once bragged to began turning their backs and laughing behind her name, Margaret collapsed. A stroke. She was found lying motionless on the living room floor of the Whitmore estate, one hand still clutching a newspaper with her son's headline. Doctors said she would never walk again. She would never speak again. She would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair in a nursing home, with a nurse changing her diapers every day. The woman who once forced Arya to kneel before guests. The woman who pushed Arya down the stairs and killed the child in her womb. The woman who said Arya was unworthy of the Whitmore name, now lay helpless, unable to lift a spoon to her mouth. Some called it karma. Some called it justice. Arya didn't call it anything. She only knew that the darkest chapter of her life had finally closed, and a new chapter was beginning. 1 year later, Arya stood before the mirror in the penthouse, overlooking all of Manhattan. She wore an elegant navy blue dress, her hair swept into a neat high bun, a platinum necklace with a sapphire pendant resting at her throat, a gift from Lucian on the night he proposed. She had changed profoundly from the trembling woman sitting on the hospital sidewalk a year earlier. Now she was Dr. Arya Sullivan Blackwood, Director of Research at Blackwood Pharmaceuticals. Her sickle cell disease treatment had received FDA approval and was saving thousands of lives around the world. She had used part of the compensation from Preston to establish the Marcus Sullivan Foundation, a charity dedicated to funding sickle cell research and supporting families living with the disease. Every time she saw the foundation's logo, a stylized image of 2 hands holding each other, Arya thought of Marcus. Her brother was gone, but his legacy would live on. Children's laughter drifted from the next room, pulling Arya from her thoughts. She smiled and stepped out. In the sun-filled living room, Lucian was sitting on the floor with one knee down, letting Ethan and Sophie climb all over him as if he were a mountain. Ethan, now 1 year old, was trying to grab Lucian's nose while Sophie clutched his finger and laughed with delight. The Shadow King, the man the entire underworld feared, was allowing 2 one-year-olds to turn him into their playground. And he was laughing. Not the cold smile he gave his enemies, but a real smile. Warm and joyful. A smile only Arya and the children ever saw. Lucian had officially adopted Ethan and Sophie 6 months earlier. He didn't have to. Preston had relinquished his parental rights in the divorce settlement, and Arya could have raised them alone. But Lucian had said they are your children, which means they are my children too. From that moment on, he became the father Ethan and Sophie deserved. He came home on time every evening to read to them. He woke up at 3 in the morning when they cried. He learned how to change diapers, mix formula, sing lullabies, things a Mafia boss never imagined himself doing. "Daddy," Sophie babbled, lifting her arms to be picked up. It was the first word she ever spoke. Not mama, but daddy. Arya had cried the first time she heard it. Lucian had too, though he would never admit it. Arya sat down beside Lucian, lifted Ethan into her lap, and Lucian slipped one arm around her shoulders while holding Sophie with the other. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "I'm thinking about a year ago," Arya said, resting her head against his shoulder. "I was sitting on the sidewalk, thinking my life was over. I didn't know it was only beginning." Lucian kissed the top of her head. "Preston Whitmore taught you a lesson," he said. Arya nodded. "Never underestimate a quiet woman, because sometimes silence isn't weakness. Silence is focus. And you," Lucian smiled. That rare smile meant only for her. "You taught me never to be afraid to love again just because I was hurt once. Darkness isn't always something to fear. Sometimes, in the dark, you see who truly stands beside you." Arya lifted her face and kissed him. Softly, sweetly, like a promise of a future neither of them ever thought they would have. Sophie and Ethan sat between them, babbling meaningless sounds, unaware that they were wrapped in a love greater than anything else in the world. And every night, before the children went to sleep, Arya kissed their foreheads and whispered the words she wished she had heard as a child. "You are loved, you are safe, and you will never have to make yourselves smaller for anyone." Preston Whitmore learned a lesson he should have learned many years earlier. Never underestimate a quiet woman, because sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is simply focus, and sometimes the person you think has nothing is only waiting for the right moment to show you who they truly are. This story reminds us that a person's worth isn't defined by their background or social status, but by what they build with their own hands and their own heart. If this story touched your heart, please tap like and share it to help spread this message to more people. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our daily videos. How do you feel about Arya's story? Have you ever faced a similar situation in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear what's in your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.